Oh, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Vienna School of International Studies. I'm Robert Schuett, the chair of the Austrian Political Science Association, and I'm delighted to be the host and introduce Ido Oren, who is this year's Fulbright-Diplomatic Academy Visiting Professor of International Studies, a very long and distinguished title. Please give Ido a warm welcome. So when Ido is not here or lecturing somewhere else on this planet, he's associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Florida. He has written extensively on international relations theory and international security affairs, which is a quite unique but important combination. His major book, Our Enemies and Us, America's Rivalries and the Making of Political Science, that was published by Cornell University Press in 2003, has been translated into Chinese and Japanese. Again, a remarkable combination in a way. And I think it's also fair to say, I hope you don't mind me saying that, Ido, that you love the study of politics and international relations. He's a former member of the Council of the American Political Science Association and a former vice president of the International Studies Association, two very important and distinguished professional bodies. Today, Ido Oren is here to give a public lecture with the thought-provoking title, US Foreign Wars, Mass Marketing and the Development of Post-Truth Politics, to which we all look forward, of course. And before I hand over to Ido, I want to say that Professor Oren in the spring 2010 was a Fulbright lecturer at the China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing. And the reason I say that is to emphasize that the Fulbright program is as important today as it was when Senator Fulbright of Arkansas set it up right after the Second World War as a means to learn from one another and as a means to facilitate global cultural and scholarly exchange. And the fact that we have Professor Oren here with us in Vienna is in large part thanks to the wonderful colleagues over at Fulbright Austria and the Austrian Fulbright Alumni Association. On that note, Ido, welcome again, and we all look forward to your public lecture, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for the very kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to add a shout out to the Fulbright Austria program for giving me the privilege, and it's a real privilege to be here in Vienna for 6 months and to be with you tonight. And I want to acknowledge Hermann Agius, who's sitting there, the director of Fulbright Austria. I also want to acknowledge that some of the research I'll be talking about today was done in collaboration with Ty Solomon from the University of Glasgow, who was a former graduate student of mine. So as you can see in the chart before you, in 2016, public usage of the word post-truth has exploded, and the Oxford Dictionaries selected it as Word of the Year. Since then, it has become commonplace to say that we have entered an era of post-truth politics. The Oxford Dictionary defined post-truth as, quote, denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Wikipedia similarly defined post-truth politics as, quote, a political culture in which debate is framed largely by appeals to emotion, and I want to underline the following phrase, and by the repeated assertion of talking points to which factual rebuttals are ignored. The spiking frequency of the word post-truth in 2016 largely reflected the improbable electoral success of Donald Trump. Whatever you think about him, he's a master marketer with a gift for coining and tirelessly repeating catchy talking points while displaying complete disregard for the factual accuracy of these catchphrases. Think about crooked Hillary, lying Ted Cruz, low energy Jeb, make America great again, which then is shortened to MAGA. We'll circle back to abbreviations later. We will build a beautiful wall along the Mexican border. And some of you may remember how during his political rallies back in 2016, Trump would join his audience in a call and response, chanting of the phrase, "Lock her up, lock her up, lock her up," Hillary Clinton. So in this lecture, I want to do two things. First, I want to suggest that although the term post-truth may be relatively new, the social and political culture that the term denotes, a culture in which we are bombarded by repetitive talking points and slogans that appeal to our emotions rather than to our rational faculties, is hardly new. What may be new about the present is not that we have entered a new era characterized by the repeated assertion of talking points, so much as that post-truth has itself become one of these repetitive talking points that saturate our discourse. Second, I want to make the point that the evolution of this post-factual culture has been intertwined with the domestic politics of US foreign policy, and especially the politics of American military intervention overseas. In fact, if there is a moment that can plausibly be said to mark the birth of this culture, it's a historical moment that occurred just over 100 years ago. In November 1916, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected to a second term as President of the United States after a campaign in which he repeatedly uttered the mantra, "He kept us out of the war." It kind of powered him to victory. Just a few short months later, the same very person who was very popular and got re-elected by keeping America out of the Great War, went to Capitol Hill to ask Congress to declare war on Germany. And in that address to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, he coined another memorable phrase: "The world must be made safe for democracy." Since then, this phrase, "making the world safe for democracy," has come to almost personify Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson was understandably worried that the American people would not support this dramatic policy shift. After all, the cause of neutrality was very popular. He was just re-elected, promising to keep America out of the war. And there were millions of Americans, including millions of ethnic Germans and Irish and Jewish Americans, whose sympathies lied with the German side more than with the allied powers of England, France, and Russia. So Wilson established a federal agency called the Committee on Public Information, CPI, that launched a massive propaganda campaign to sell the war to the American people. The committee used newspapers, magazines, posters like these ones, and what was then new technologies of radio and movies to drum up enthusiasm for the war. Additionally, the CPI sponsored and trained 75,000 individuals to serve as 4-minute men. And these 4-minute men made millions of very short speeches around the country in support of the war effort. In these 4-minute speeches, the speakers did not present detailed evidence and rational arguments that appealed to the intellect of their listeners. It's quite impossible to do that in 4 minutes. What they rather did was to repeat talking points and key phrases over and over and over again. The historian David Kennedy, who wrote the definitive history of the American home front during what was then known as the Great War, wrote that the performances of the 4-minute men increasingly resembled the 2 minutes of hate exercises that George Orwell would later describe in his novel 1984. Now, the propaganda campaign orchestrated by the Wilson administration succeeded remarkably in creating public enthusiasm for the war effort. And this success gave participants in the campaign the idea that the same techniques that were so successful in selling the war to the American people could also be used profitably in peacetime to sell consumer products. Take, for example, this gentleman, Edward Bernays. He was born here in Vienna, immigrated with his family to the United States at a very young age. Interestingly, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And as a young man, he worked for the Committee on Public Information and actively participated in this propaganda campaign. And he became convinced, in his own words, that, quote, if this could be used for war, it can be used for peace. Bernays went on to have a very long and successful career as one of America's leading experts in advertising, marketing, and public relations. He was often described as the father of public relations. One of his best known and most successful sales campaign encouraged women in the 20s and early 30s to kind of smoke in public, which was uncommon at the time, on behalf of the brand Lucky Strike. So the successful selling of America's military intervention in Europe to a public that previously was quite happy with non-intervention was a pivotal event that ushered in the age of mass marketing. An age in which sellers of products were no longer content with just providing facts about their products. In the mass society that gradually emerged in the decades after World War I, the marketplace became characterized less by selling goods and more by the aggressive marketing of brands. Less by providing factual arguments about a product than by fostering emotional identification with values symbolized by a brand. And arguably the most significant characteristic of modern mass marketing, it's so ubiquitous that we rarely notice, or there's little commentary about it, so the most significant characteristic of marketing is repetition. Repetition, repetition, repetition. So advertisers continually bombard us with symbols like brand logos, like the Nike swoosh, icons like Marlboro Man, and taglines, just do it. These images and words are repeated over and over again with the aim that they would become etched in our mind and settle in our ear like an earworm. If you're familiar with this concept, I'm sure many of you have experienced it when a certain tune gets stuck in your ear, in your head, and you just can't get rid of it. As the political and corporate consultant, Frank Luntz, explained in this book that was published in 2007, the messages that successfully become stuck in our heads are typically characterized by brevity, they're brief, and by simplicity. Effective advertisers do not use a sentence when a phrase will suffice, and they use abbreviations whenever possible. Think about how the Macintosh computer became Mac, and Federal Express is now officially FedEx. And who remembers that CNN used to be cable news network? It's just CNN, KFC, and on and on. The point here is not that every marketing campaign becomes successful. The history of advertising is littered with failures. But of those advertising campaigns that do succeed, perhaps their most remarkable feature is that the verbal and the visual symbols spouted, repeated by the marketers unite with the brand that is being marketed. As Frank Luntz put it, the most successful taglines are not seen as slogans for a product. They are the product. And similarly, the most popular corporate icons come to personify their companies. Ronald McDonald, Marlboro Man, the Energizer Bunny, they are the products. They don't just tell us about products, they are the products. Now, Frank Luntz is a practical man, not a philosopher, but still his argument can be easily translated into the idiom of the philosophy of language. What Luntz is saying is basically that the verbal symbols repeated by advertisers sometimes perform successful speech acts. These phrases become the things that they ostensibly refer to. They create reality rather than merely describe some pre-existing factual reality. So I argued earlier that the world of mass marketing and advertising was significantly shaped by the politics, the domestic politics of World War I. So it shouldn't be surprising that the techniques, as the techniques of advertising have become more sophisticated in the 20th century, they were increasingly used in politics as much as in commerce. As Samuel Popkin, who's a leading scholar of the US presidency, noted, working to develop a brand name has long ago become part and parcel of preparing for a run at higher office. In 1952, an infectious tagline that was written by Pete Peterson. He was a marketing executive. "I like Ike," helped power Dwight Eisenhower into the White House. And since then, if not earlier, the branding strategies of US presidential candidates have prominently included the spouting forth of catchphrases. It's morning in America again. That was Reagan, 1984. It's the economy stupid, was coined by James Carville over there, who was the political advisor to Bill Clinton, initially in an internal memo for the campaign, but then it kind of became viral, as we said today, and became closely associated, or kind of personifying, you might say, the Clinton campaign. Obama, 2008, yes, we can. I vividly remember watching political rallies of Barack Obama in 2008, and the kind of bonding, the call and response pattern between him and his audience. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Make America great again. Trump. So such phrases, short phrases, to the extent that they are successful, become synonymous with the candidate. And of course, President Trump may have taken branding in politics to a new level because his very last name, Trump, was a recognizable brand name long before he entered politics. So to kind of recapitulate my argument so far, I'm saying that the hallmark of post-truth culture appeals to emotion, and particularly the repetition of talking points that do not merely describe a factual reality, but in some sense create or shape it, have been part of our social, economic, political life for many decades. And the shaping of reality through this continual repetition of short phrases is not confined to domestic affairs. In fact, the origins of what we now call post-truth politics go back to the campaign to sell to the American people the American intervention in Europe in 1917. What I'd like to do in the remainder of my time is return to the realm of US foreign policy and focus on a more recent case in which a propaganda campaign orchestrated by an administration succeeded in drumming up enthusiasm for a war. And I'm deliberately using the term drumming up because this campaign metaphorically amounted to the rhythmic beating of war drums. The campaign succeeded not by providing the American people with a factual argument about a foreign threat, which the public then kind of processed and considered on the intellectual level and found persuasive. It rather succeeded by incessantly repeating a catchphrase, and by virtue of that catchphrase being endlessly repeated, echoing in the public sphere and in the media. So, like creating a metaphorical drumbeat or a choral chanting, like a mass chorus. Weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. And this choral incantation of the phrase, I would argue, operated like a speech act. In other words, it did not just describe some facts out there, but it created and shaped a reality of a grave sense of existential danger. So in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, even though the mastermind of the attacks was based in Afghanistan, the George W. Bush administration began to depict Iraq as a grave menace to American and world security. During the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, The central theme of the administration's case against Iraq was the danger of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Beginning in January 2002, President Bush and senior officials uttered this phrase multiple times in most of their public appearances. In August of 2002, the White House was put on the defensive by a growing opposition, galvanized by an opinion article published in the Wall Street Journal, authored by Brent Scowcroft, who was a close confidant of the Bush family. He was the national security advisor of the president's father. To regain momentum, the White House Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, convened a high-level group whose mission was to market the war or a war in Iraq. Although the formation of this group, which was called the White House Iraq Group, was not made public, Andrew Card hinted at its mission when he told the New York Times in early September 2002 that, quote, from a marketing point of view, you don't introduce new products in August. Among the members of the White House Iraq Group were several specialists in strategic communications, including the President's senior political advisor, Karl Rove. And in a remarkably candid comment that Karl Rove later, in 2004, made to Ron Suskind in the New York Times Magazine, Rove said that guys like you, like the journalists, the pundits, the scholars, you lived, quote, in what we call the reality-based community, which Rove defined as, quote, people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. Rove then said that the world doesn't work like that anymore. We are an empire now, he said, and when we act, we create our own reality. We create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality, we will act again, creating other new realities which you can study too. So I have no idea if Karl Rove ever studied the philosophy of language, but his comment surely sounded like he had a solid grasp of the concept of speech acts. So, like shaping reality through speech. The White House Iraq Group coordinated a dramatic public relations offensive to sell the war to the American public. With the launching of this campaign, the use of the catchphrase, weapons of mass destruction, by administration officials increased markedly. So for example, in her appearance on CNN on the first day of this marketing campaign, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice said these words, uttered this phrase 13 times in just a few minutes. Fast forwarding to early January 2003, you see in this picture President Bush speaking to troops in Fort Hood, Texas. That was about 2 months before the invasion of Iraq. And here's what he said. The Iraqi regime has used weapons of mass destruction. They not only had weapons of mass destruction, they used weapons of mass destruction. They used weapons of mass destruction in other countries. They have used weapons of mass destruction on their own people. That's why I say Iraq is a threat, a real threat. So, in sum, the incessant repetition of the phrase weapons of mass destruction was a central aspect of the administration's campaign to sell the war to the American people. Senator Lincoln Chafee from Rhode Island, who was the only Republican senator to oppose the war, was hardly exaggerating when he said or complained that the administration's case for war consisted in, quote, a steady drumbeat, his words, not mine, a steady drumbeat of weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. Now, in order for this phrase to become unified with the threat that it supposedly described, it wasn't enough for it to be repeated by the administration. It also had to be accepted and adopted and repeated by the media and by the public at large. And indeed, before too long, weapons of mass destruction became a daily staple of the American press. As you see in this slide, the frequency of the term in the Wall Street Journal, and similar patterns apply to other major publications. Basically, it was non-existent in the 1980s, picks up somewhat in the 1990s before spiking dramatically in its frequency in 2002 and 2003. And as you can see in the next slide, during the months preceding the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, the incidence of weapons of mass destruction in leading US publications skyrocketed, and much of this increase coincided with the launching of the government's marketing campaign in early September 2002. No sooner than it flooded the US media, the phrase weapons of mass destruction invaded also the everyday talk of ordinary Americans at dinner tables and the water cooler at work and so on. This linguistic invasion was sort of acknowledged by another organization that selects words of the year. So the American Dialect Society chose weapons of mass destruction as the 2002 word of the year. Now, as I noted earlier, in commercial marketing, some of the most memorable catchphrases are abbreviations like CNN, KFC, and so on. So just as these corporations have profited from the abridgment of their brand names, so has the marketing of the Iraq War benefited from the abbreviation of the kind of somewhat long and flabby weapons of mass destruction into a slim and trim acronym, WMD. What this chart shows is that the acronym WMD almost never appeared in America's major newspapers in the 1990s, but during the lead up to the Iraq War, the same publications printed this abbreviation hundreds of times. And as the war approached, increasingly the acronym became so common that they no longer had to spell out the full three words. It sufficed to say just WMD, WMD, WMD. So the drumbeat became kind of peppier. The political philosopher Herbert Marcuse once wrote a really insightful comment or note on abbreviation, on abridgment. And he acknowledged that abbreviating words definitely has a useful function, right? It simplifies speech and writing, but it also has an inconspicuous rhetorical function. It helps to suppress undesired questions. So, for example, when you say NATO, it doesn't suggest what North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So when you spell out the full name, maybe someone might wonder, Greece, Turkey, North Atlantic. When you say NATO, you kind of remove it further from any sort of factual reference. So in keeping with Marcuse's insightful comment, I note that as that popularization of WMD helped, quote unquote, repress undesired questions surrounding administration statement, like the statement I quoted a few minutes ago, that they used weapons of mass destruction in other countries. They have used weapons of mass destruction on their own people. Because WMD elides the words mass destruction, the growing prominence of the abbreviation made it less likely that people perhaps might stop their chanting for a minute and might ask, what are weapons of mass destruction anyways? Do the weapons that the Iraqis used against their own people, I suppose he was referring to chemical attacks, really cause any mass destruction? Do they cause destruction on the scale, for example, of nuclear weapons? So the abbreviation of the term took it further away from any sort of grounding in reality. And it performed, once again, the rhetorical function of taking us even farther away from concrete factual reality, the chanting of the full phrase. Now you might be wondering, but wait a minute, abbreviations aside, isn't the term weapons of mass destruction a clear and unproblematic reference to alleged facts on the ground in Iraq? Can't we just check the facts and determine whether it is true that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction? And this was precisely how the debate in the United States in the aftermath of the war was shaped, or was framed. Did Iraq truly possess weapons, these weapons? And if not, did the Bush administration lie to the American people, or was it merely an unintended, unintentional intelligence failure? But I want to suggest to you that it's not so simple to check the facts about weapons of mass destruction, because like other terms that have been common in foreign policy discourse, this phrase is ambiguous, and it has multiple meanings, and it may mean different things to different people. What exactly is a rogue state, ethnic cleansing, soft power? The precise meanings of such terms, like the meaning of weapons of mass destruction, are not as self-evident as you might think. Now, I have done, with Taisam, we have done research into the history of the concept of weapons of mass destruction. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over it and just summarize by saying that weapons of mass destruction is an ambiguous term throughout its history, which goes back roughly to World War II. The meaning of the phrase has been contested and has been changeable. It has had multiple meanings, and it meant different things to different people. Furthermore, even if foreign policy experts may have had a clear idea in their heads what the term meant in, say, 2002, 2003, the fact remains that before the Bush administration started endlessly repeating the term in 2002, most Americans have either not heard the term before, or if they have, they did not share a clear concept of what it precisely meant. I want to make now one final point. As you may recall, or at least those of you who are old enough to to remember the Iraq War and the debate in the United States. The Iraq War was a divisive issue in American politics, and a significant minority of Americans adamantly opposed the invasion. And yet the chanting of WMD, WMD, WMD transcended the political divide as opponents of the war embraced the terms and repeated it reflexively and uncritically. So for example, on the same news program in which, as I mentioned earlier, Condoleezza Rice repeatedly referred to weapons of mass destruction in September of 2002, Senator Bob Graham from Florida, who would later vote against the war, he himself also said weapons of mass destruction many times as he was debating Condoleezza Rice. By joining the chorus chanting weapons of mass destruction, WMD, the opponents of the war helped, inadvertently, but they helped consolidate a generalized atmosphere of danger, even as on the intellectual level they were not persuaded by the administration's case for war. When Americans were asked by pollsters at the time whether they supported or opposed the use of force against Iraq, the results were very consistent over time. About 60% for the use of force and about a third against. And it didn't bounce much. It was pretty consistent over time. So, remarkably, the launching of the administration's war marketing campaign in September 2002 didn't make a dent in this pattern. There is little evidence then that the administration actually persuaded the American people to change their minds about the Iraqi threat. The invasion of Iraq was sold to the American people not by making them think together so much as by making both proponents and opponents of the war chant together WMD, WMD, WMD. I'm almost done. I simply love this passage from, it was published in a magazine that is now defunct, called Salon Magazine by Michael Kinsley. During that time when Americans were debating, why haven't we found these weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and was it an intelligence failure, or did the administration lie to us? I think Kinsley was the only voice I could find who actually got it right. He didn't use highfalutin words like I use, speech acts, but maybe because of that he expressed the point maybe more eloquently than I did. So he said, by now, WMD have taken on a mythic role in which fact doesn't play much of a part. The phrase itself, weapons of mass destruction, is more like an incantation than a description of anything in particular. The term is new to almost everybody, and the concern it officially embodies was on almost no one's radar screen until recently. Unofficially, weapons of mass destruction are to George W. Bush what fairies were to Peter Pan. We do believe in weapons of mass destruction. We do. And if we all believe hard enough, they will be there. And it's working. So much for Michael Kinsley. Okay, having talked to you about talking points, I want to conclude with a few, talking points or takeaways that maybe you could chant on your way out if you want. The repetition of short catchy phrases is a key practice of what has come in recent years to be called post-truth politics. The right way I'm suggesting to think about these phrases is not what do they refer to or what do they describe, but to think about what do they do, what do they perform, how do they construct reality. I try to tell you that these practices are hardly new, that it goes at least as far back as the First World War. So the historical development of this practice has been significantly intertwined with and shaped with the domestic politics of US foreign interventions. So thank you so much for your patience, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Ido.
Yes.
Thank you so much, of course, for this insightful lecture, as was expected. I'm fairly certain that there will be lots of questions, but one of the joys that I'm having is that I can sneak in two. Okay. At least from my point of view, one actually concerns IR theory, if I may, and the other one current US foreign policy. And to these two questions, there's a backstory to it. And it's your backstory in many ways. Because I know, of course, and some in the audience to know that you did your PhD at the University of Chicago in the 1980s, if I'm right. And of course, the University of Chicago is known to be this kind of hotbed of political realist IR theory. Old and new, people like Hans Morgenthau used to teach at Chicago, and today we have neo-realists such as the controversial John Mearsheimer. My first question is relating to theory and methodology. It's a broad one. It really is, in a way, how do you approach IR international relations in general? Because I recall, because I was a young PhD student back then in the UK, you wrote an article in the early 2000s called The Unrealism of Contemporary Realism. Of course, classical realists used to be very much afraid of the role of emotions in foreign affairs in general. And now you're one theorist that talks about Freud, that talks about Bernays. You bring him in. You even mentioned Herbert Marcuse. Hans Morgenthau used to be fairly close to this kind of thinking, almost anthropological thinking, the use of psychoanalysis, if you wish, to understand the reality of foreign policy. But in a way, this is now all gone with this kind of quantitative political science methodology that we are now having. So how do you do it? Are you a classical realist in this sense? Is this what you've taken from your time at Chicago, or are you something entirely new in terms of IR theory with this kind of work that you're doing? The second question, this is of course the direct outcome of the first one is, as you've mentioned, you can use mass marketing, and there is this kind of Freudian element to it. You can use it as drumbeats for going to war, as in your two examples. But you could also use mass marketing techniques as drumbeats for not going to war, for a kind of nasty nationalism or even nasty isolationist policy, if you wish. And that would be the practical question for US foreign policy. What should we expect in terms of mass marketing? Which way? Because it doesn't seem no longer that it's using American power. It's more like retreating from that kind of the world that we used to see.
Thank you for am I I'm still on, or did I turn off? Okay. Thank you for these two provocative questions. I'll take the first one first. So yes, as Robert here pointed out, I attended graduate school at the University of Chicago in the sort of second half of the 1980s. There was still a thing called the Cold War going on. Not even the greatest minds of international relations, by the way, had the foggiest clue that it was going to be over pretty soon. Hans Morgenthau, who you mentioned, was already not only retired from the University of Chicago, I believe he died in 1980, so I never met him in person, but you mentioned John Mearsheimer. I took seminars with him, and he also was a member of my dissertation committee. So for those of you who are familiar with or are interested in international relations theory, at least in that period, the study of international relations, IR for short, was dominated by what is sometimes referred to as grand theorizing or by paradigms, and with realism playing perhaps the lead role, followed by neoliberal institutionalism. And the kind of big hegemonic figure, if you may, in the realist theorizing camp was Kenneth Waltz. Some of you may have heard his name or have read his work. And Kenneth Waltz, and so to me and my fellow students at the time, reading Theory of International Politics, which Waltz published in 1979, so it was still fairly new in the 1980s. We read it almost like a scriptural text. To this day, I can quote phrases from various pages in the book. And Kenneth Waltz, in that book, not interestingly in his earlier work, like Men's State and War, which I consider a marvelous book, sort of turned realism. It came to be known as structural realism or neorealism. I think took much of the life out of realism. It turned it into a pretty sort of scientific theory, basically arguing that international relations is dominated by anarchy, which is the lack of a supranational authority in international relations, and under anarchic conditions, all that states care about is power, and with a focus on material power and military capabilities, and they jockey for basically balancing against each other. I hope I did an okay job of kind of summarizing the theory. And to be honest, as much as my gut instincts have always been, I think, kind of on the realist side, because I think you can't even begin to study politics but first, before anything else, power. Right, and that's realism. But I was not then or now comfortable with this really very narrow conception of realism. It is only later in my career, because they didn't quite expose us at the University of Chicago at the time to sort of the older realists. I mean, we heard their names, but we didn't really seriously read and engage with their work. So you mentioned Hans Morgenthau, and I would add another name, Edward H. Carr, a British scholar who wrote in 1939 a classic book, which to me is one of the two best books in international relations, The 20 Years Crisis. And Carr, of course, made the point against the backdrop of the near collapse of the League of Nations and the experience of the interwar period that, as I just said, you can't begin to approach the study of international politics without considering power relations. But his conception of power was far more kind of multifaceted, less narrow than what Waltz and his contemporaries would embrace decades later. And in fact, in chapter 8, I think, of the 20 years crisis, he breaks down power into three components. Military power, of course, is very important, economic power, and third, power over opinion. And there he speaks precisely about the kind of propaganda, and using the term propaganda, that I was alluding to in my talk, and he specifically says there that the Great War was a turning point, that propaganda organized by nation states is a fairly new thing that has arrived with the advent of mass politics. And he put his finger on, not specifically in the United States, but on the Great War as when it kind of rose in kind of full flowering. So, if I may go a little bit beyond your question, but still on the question of IR theory, if sort of later as my intellectual horizons have, I'd like to think, broadened and developed after I graduated from the University of Chicago, I tried to keep this talk, not too heavily theoretical, but perhaps those of you who are familiar with contemporary international relations theory may be familiar with the idea of securitization that was pioneered by Danish scholar Ole Wever in the mid-90s. I'd better not go into the weeds on securitization, but I would just acknowledge that my approach here, about particularly on how Iraq was made into kind of an imminent and grave danger, fits within the parameters of this securitization approach that didn't even exist when I was in graduate school. Give me a cue about the second question.
The second one was about contemporary American foreign policy in a way, because in your two cases, Wilson and George W. Bush, you made the point these were the drumbeats for going to war.
Yes.
But what we perhaps are seeing, and the elephant in the room is very clear. You've mentioned him, I think, on your very first slide. Is maybe it's not so much the danger any longer or the fear any longer that we are going to see too much American action on the international scene, but perhaps there's now the danger that we, depending on where you stand, of course, that we might see too little in the future. So how do you see this? The drumbeats for what? For going to war, or drumbeats for decidedly no longer going to war?
First, let me acknowledge, I think you're right, that in principle, from sort of a marketing standpoint, you could use these techniques, just like Edward Bernays thought back more than 100 years ago, in peace as much as in war. So I'm reminded of President Trump, who initially used the short phrase, which I think is brilliant, Rocket Man. Do you remember who he called Rocket Man? Is it Kim Jong-un? But then all of a sudden he changed his tune on Kim. So Trump then took a very kind of hawkish position, using these kind of branding technique, Rocket Man, Rocket Man, Rocket Man, to sort of demonize North Korea and possibly prepare the ground maybe for using force against it. But then, for whatever reason, he had a change of heart and developed this kind of romance, if you may, with Kim Jong-un. And then he kept talking repeatedly about the beautiful letter that he received from him. So I suppose you can talk about beautiful letters and other, short phrases in the interest of kind of more peaceful policies. But I would say that in practice, as opposed to in principle, if you look at the history of foreign relations, it's hard for me to. It may be that I just didn't apply my mind sufficiently to find an examples, but. I can't come up with like major examples of like a peace campaign that had these characteristics. On the question of intervention more broadly, of course in my talk I didn't kind of address the normative question of foreign military interventions by the United States overseas good or bad, appropriate, inappropriate? I would just say, but you are kind of pushing me to address it, so I'll share some thoughts. It's a very, of course, complex and multifaceted issue. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not saying there are no circumstances whatsoever under which the United States or other perhaps great powers should intervene militarily overseas. I think there are basically two ways in which to kind of approach the question, right? If you are an American, unlike, say, the citizens of, let's pick on New Zealand or Peru or perhaps Austria, who may have very, good intentions and want to do good in the world, but frankly, it's kind of an academic question whether to intervene halfway around the world. There are very, very few states, maybe just one even in the world today, that can not only debate and discuss it, but possibly use force halfway around the world. And so in the United States, it's a more kind of relevant debate. And basically, you can approach it by asking, is this intervention good or bad, right or wrong, ethical or unethical? So basically use the language of your conscience, okay? Good and bad. Or you can approach it in terms of realpolitik. Is it our business? Is it in our national interest? And here, once again, I want to follow Kenneth Waltz, not in that later book, but in Men, the State and War, which I think is the second greatest book ever written, or the 20th century at least, in international relations. In chapter 4, he has this really marvelous discussion or critique of liberal Wilsonian foreign policy and their tendency to think about foreign policy in these terms of moral and immoral, right and wrong, as opposed to in terms of interest. And he critiques then the tendency to go to these wars to end all war, wars to make the world more peaceful. And he has a great line on page 111, something to the effect that the liberalism, a philosophy of tolerance, of humility, of doubt, acquires a hubris of its own. So I tend to follow Waltz in thinking that the United States would be better off thinking about its foreign interventions in terms of, is it in our interest or not? So sometimes you might conclude that it is in our interest and it is appropriate to do it, but overall it puts greater restraint on the impulse to use force overseas than going on these wars to end all wars, to make the world more peaceful.
Wow. Super. Ido.
It's not me, it's Kenneth. No. I'm just channeling Kenneth Waltz.
You've just shown us why I said that you love politics. You even know the page numbers of all these great books. It's amazing. I think that's. But you've suffered enough from my questions. I think it's not time to open the floor. There's a microphone somewhere near you. There's Victoria. Shall we begin with? I think Andreas. Andreas was first.
So, good evening. My name is Andreas Weichenschlager. First and foremost, thank you for being here, for holding this lecture, and also, of course, to the distinguished guests of the Fulbright Austria Association. As I said, I'm a student here, so my question concerns more the future, I would say. I think I wouldn't go too far in saying that we have a very fragmented political scene globally right now. because of obviously post-truth politics, fake news, AI and stuff. So once, like right now, this notion is in motion, I think it is near enough impossible to reverse. So I think it is on us now to think about solutions for the future. So how would you educate people and future generations and also enlighten people on how to deal with, well, the flow of information and the rising difficulty in seeing what is in fact true and what's not? Thank you.
Yeah. It's not new. What can we do, Ido? What can we do about this? Because you mentioned it's not a new thing.
What can we do is a very good and a vexing question. So as I said toward the end of my presentation, one interesting feature of these domestic politics of the Iraq War in the United States prior to the invasion was the fact that inadvertently or unintentionally, opponents of using force against Iraq, they too adopted the term weapons of mass destruction, and they debated sort of on the, like part of the debate was on the factual level, no, Iraq doesn't really, or does it not have weapons of mass destruction, but be it as it may, they, as I tried to argue, only amplified this kind of generalized sense of threat, even once again as they were trying to put a brake on the war. So it raises the vexing question: is what do you do if you develop an awareness of these marketing techniques and you become concerned and your politics is in opposition to whether it is a war or whatever other political platform that is sort of being sold to you. Can you oppose it, or can you push back again without using the words that are part and parcels of the sales campaign? And it's very difficult. It may be impossible to oppose a war, to counter Iraqi weapons of mass destruction without saying weapons of mass destruction. So the only perhaps unsatisfactory and provisional answer I can give is, yes, you might have to use the words, but try, first of all, be conscious of what's going on and think about what these words that are kind of spouted at you, what they do and what their performative function is as opposed to what they describe, and try to call attention to it. Perhaps one way of calling attention is to do satire, like in a way what Kinsley was doing in this article, right? Only it was too late. By then the invasion already took place. But use it in kind of a mocking ways, or through satire, or in other ways try to call attention to the words.
Super, thank you. I think there was Jakob to make life easier for Victoria. Thank you.
So I also want to thank you, first of all, for your important thoughts on this very complicating topic. Sorry. My name is Jakob Heistinger. I'm also a MAIS2 student. So my question would be, how would you assess the escalating role of social media platforms such as Twitter in exacerbating the influence of misinformation propaganda regarding US foreign wars? And what policy-making strategies would you propose to address this growing challenge? Thank you.
On social media, I would say I'm not much of an expert on social media. I use it to a limited degree. I know that you students here at the Academy just a few days ago had a conference here on digital diplomacy, so I'm sure some of you are greater expert than me on social media. So I don't really have any concrete proposals or insights specifically about social media, except perhaps to suggest that, maybe sometimes we understandably overstate the technological change that we are experiencing in our lifetime and have a tendency to, this is unprecedented and it's like never happened before and there are no parallels in history. I think to the people who were subjected to the propaganda campaign of the Wilson administration in 1917, the radio, which was like brand new, pictures, the motion pictures, movies, which were used by the Committee of Public Information, may have been as, new and maybe too many exciting as social media are today. So I know I perhaps didn't fully answer your question, but that's the best I can do.
Excellent, thank you very much. Is there, please, gentlemen, in the second row.
Thank you for your interesting, provocative presentation and for this model. And as I was thinking about pushing it back beyond World War I was thinking about the Civil War in the U.S. and the use of, I think particularly James McPherson wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning history called The Battle Cry of Freedom. And it's about a song that both sides used to mobilize. So by the Union forces, Confederate, they used the same song to mobilize people. So they was doing, and Honest Abe was very clever to present images and just to name Honest Abe. And so that was going on before World War I. Then I even was thinking back to the Revolutionary War and how the rebels mobilized freedom for wealthy white males by this caricature of the British royalty. And is that a fundamental problem of challenge to democracy? That the demos doesn't have time to deliberate, so they want short answers. That's kind of my question.
I think you're definitely onto something by by suggesting that, at least to some degree, this kind of bonding through singing together, moving together, dancing together, drumming together. In fact, you can go back much farther into past history, maybe to ancient times, when actually societies were more face-to-face and they literally, not just metaphorically, beat the war drums and also engaged in war dancing. There's a marvelous book by the now late University of Chicago historian William McNeill, published in 1995, and it's called Keeping Together in Time. If you or anyone else is interested, I highly recommend this marvelous book. And kind of the key point of the book, it's sort of like a global world history of keeping together in time, and how not only oral communication, which is of course very important, but also moving together has been a powerful force in human affairs for now many thousands of years, and the kind of just good feeling that, drumming, dancing, moving, the kind of bodily movement of people. Think about what happens in a rock concert. The idea of, through dancing, reaching a state of trance, like transformation. So once again, you can trace this dynamic of people bonding together. Think also about churches and not just Christianity, but many other religions that involve people chanting together, singing together, dancing together, moving together, and how it creates these social bonds that can be used for war, or can also be used for beautiful things. And so I suppose in the more contemporary era of mass marketing, the advent of mass society and also technology has made it possible to kind of engulf not just a village or a face-to-face society, but mass societies in these dynamics.
Okay. Two more questions. There's one gentleman in the final row, please.
My name is Günther Fellinger. I'm Austrian pro-NATO activist. Our whole world order is built on American power and American interventionism, especially, defeating the Nazis in Europe in the Second World War and building the structures we have now today. So was your speech not a bit negative about American interventionism and American readiness also to fight for values globally? And you focused very much on the Iraq War and this invention maybe of the casus belli, or this kind of story of weapons of mass destruction, but less about 9/11, which was the ultimate trigger point which led to these wars in the Middle East. Yeah? And so a little bit of a positive, also for the students here, a more positive view on American interventionism would be, I think, necessary. And my concrete question now, in the Ukraine war, are you supporting American intervention in the Ukraine war to defeat Putin's aggression? And do you think the American political force in Ukraine is justified?
I'm here not representing the US government or the American people. You asked about the Ukraine. As far as intervention as in American, as they say, boots on the ground, no, I'm opposed to it. I tend to think about it in terms of, do I want my children of my friends, to go and frankly sacrifice their life for Ukraine? I don't think I do. So I'm definitely supportive of military, humanitarian, and other forms of aid, but it's the war of Ukraine and not an American war.
Okay.
That's
Hamza,
my viewpoint.
Thank you. Thank you. Hamza and Reed, please. First, Hamza.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. My name is Hamza. I'm a student at the Academy. I prepared many questions, but I will keep it short. You mentioned the role of the Wilson administration, the Iraqi war, and so on and so forth, but to what extent do you see the rise of post-truth politics as a uniquely American phenomena, or are there similar trends observable in other countries? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I live in the United States and I'm an American citizen, so I know a lot more about the United States than most other countries, I confess. My sense is, in fact, going back to E.H. Carr and Chapter 8, where he emphasizes the emergence during the Great War of power over opinion and organized propaganda as kind of a third dimension of power. He was British, and he was certainly not writing specifically and narrowly about the United States, but I'm sure there is literature out there also. I know, for example, that the British government launched a propaganda campaign specifically in the United States in order to counteract the non-interventionist policy of the United States until 1917. So it surely was not strictly an American phenomenon. I would not presume that if you did some research or opened your eyes or you're familiar with other countries and other circumstances, you wouldn't find similar processes at work in other countries.
Okay. And last, Reed, please, last but not least.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you for your very enlightening talk. My name is Reed. I'm also a student at the Academy. In your talk, you mentioned very heavily that the main actors recently, in terms of post-truth politics, have been Republican right-wing actors such as Donald Trump and George Bush. Would you estimate that this division of post-truth politics versus maintaining a normalcy in politics that existed before is forming along ideological lines as such, or are the lines being blurred between them? In your opinion, do you see these post-truth politics transcending the political divide as with the talk of WMDs did previously, or is this still being divided upon ideological lines, at least in the American context? Thank you.
My talk didn't specifically focus on ideology and ideological divides. If anything, I was hoping to make the case that there is, notwithstanding policy and perhaps ideological differences between the George W. Bush administration some 20 years ago and more recently Donald Trump, and quite possibly a second presidency of Donald Trump coming up, that notwithstanding policy and ideological differences, as far as the advent of what has come to be called post-truth politics, there is great continuity. And so Trump should not be understood to have just come out of nowhere, right? He may be taking these kind of branding techniques in politics to a new level, right? But it's not as if he took a fork in the road and made a sharp departure from patterns of political campaigning, political sales campaign, domestically and foreign policy relative to his predecessors, and especially the administration of George W. Bush.
Okay. Ido, I think before we draw things to a close here, and thank you, I just want to say that there will be a reception afterwards following this public lecture by you, and everybody is of course cordially invited to join us and continue the conversation with you. I want to thank again Fulbright Austria for co-hosting this event. I want to thank you all for coming and for being with us online. And of course, we want to thank you, Ido Oren, for your fantastic public lecture here in Vienna. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ido.